In this video, I want to take you back to the very beginning to explore a society that stands as a contender for the title of humanity's very first technological civilization, the Sumerians. I want to show you how, across thousands of years, the Sumerians built a society that laid the foundation for everything that would come after. They invented writing, mathematics, the wheel, and constructed some of the largest cities the world had ever seen. I will explore what happened, what led to their eventual and catastrophic downfall. So fasten your seatbelt as we dive into today's story. But first, you'll have incredible luck if you like and subscribe before this video ends. In the year 1625, an Italian nobleman named Pietro della Valle set out on a journey across the Middle East. Della Valle was no ordinary traveler. He was a remarkable explorer who had already set foot throughout Asia, North Africa, and even India. He had married a Christian Assyrian princess in Damascus, and now the two of them journeyed together, riding on horseback and camelback, always accompanied by local guides. At that time, traveling through this region was incredibly dangerous. The Ottoman and Persian empires were at war, each vying for control of Baghdad, while local bandit gangs took advantage of the chaos to rob travelers. In those days, even lions still roamed these hills. With so many dangers all around, Della Valle's guides remained constantly on edge, ever watchful for any threat. On the 18th of June, 1625, they spotted a group of tribesmen on the distant horizon. The guides, sensing potential danger, immediately began searching for a place to hide. From afar, they caught sight of the massive silhouettes of ancient ruins, as Della Valle would later recall in his memoirs. Della Valle's party stayed at these ruins for several nights, while the guides negotiated with the local chief to secure safe passage. During the day, under the harsh sun of Uruk, Della Valle spent his time wandering among those magnificent remnants. As their journey remained delayed, he took advantage of the mornings to examine the ruins of this ancient structure more closely. He was puzzled, unable to determine what this structure might have once been, but he noticed that it was built from exceptionally fine bricks, most of them stamped with strange, ancient-looking symbols. He observed that these bricks were not held together with mortar, but rather with bitumen or pitch. Della Valle found himself fascinated by the shards inscribed with script, scattered all across the ruined ground. Venturing deeper into the ruins, he carefully recorded several of the symbols he saw, repeated again and again on the stones and baked clay fragments. Among the markings he discovered during his brief time there, two particular shapes stood out for their frequent appearance. One resembled a pyramid, the other an 8-pointed star. Neither Della Valle nor his wife had any idea that they had just set foot upon the ruins of Ur, the city that was once the heart of one of humanity's earliest civilizations. This society was known as Sumer, the place where so many of the world's great achievements would first emerge and lay the foundation for the modern age. In the end, the negotiations with the local chieftain broke down, and Della Valle's guides no longer felt it was safe to camp among the ruins. They departed in the darkness, crossing the desert in search of a safer refuge. Among Della Valle's belongings were several clay tablets he had collected at Ur. These were, in fact, the very first samples of a dead and forgotten language to ever arrive in Europe after thousands of years lost to history. On his journey home, Della Valle must have spent many moments turning those tablets over in his hands, contemplating the mysterious ancient symbols etched into the clay. Who had built these vast mounds and mighty bricks out here in the endless desert? What did the signs on those broken clay fragments mean? And if such a great city had truly existed, what force on earth could have caused it to collapse and vanish without a trace? In the southeastern highlands of Turkey, a chain of snow-capped limestone mountains rises more than 3,000 meters above the plains below. This is the Taurus Range. The mountains are so steep that rain clouds often struggle to pass over them. Instead, the clouds gather in the valleys, producing heavy annual rainfall. In the spring and summer, the warmer air only thickens the clouds, and fierce thunderstorms roar through the mountain passes, their echoes bouncing off the cliffs. The steep slopes of the Taurus Range are carved by water into streams and waterfalls, while underground rivers bore deep into the rock, forming some of the largest caves in all of Asia. The name Taurus comes from the Latin word for bull, and the reason is easy to see. Throughout these mountains, archaeologists have uncovered ancient temples adorned with terracotta statues of bulls. Since antiquity, the people here have worshipped the storm god Teshub, believing he rode on the back of a great bull, perhaps because the booming thunder reminded them of the pounding hooves of giant beasts. These torrential spring rains, with their thunder and lightning, pour into the streams, joining rivers that rise from the snowy passes of Armenia. Before long, these small waterways gather together and flow down onto the vast plain below, becoming two mighty rivers that run parallel for nearly 2,000 kilometers. Today, The immense delta of these two rivers forms the territory known as Uruk. In Arabic, this region is called Bilad al-Rafidain, the land of two rivers. In the West, this land has long been known by its ancient Greek name, which combines the words Mesos, means in the middle, and Potamos, means river. Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers. Those two great rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates. For millennia, they have brought life to the flat plains of Iraq, and the source of that life comes from something that seems utterly lifeless, the stone high up in the mountains. Most rocks are held together by tiny grains of two minerals known as quartz and feldspar. Together, these make up more than 60% of the Earth's crust. As the rivers pass through mountain gorges and underground streams, their waters wash away the softer parts of the stone. Quartz and feldspar, however, do not dissolve in water, so these tiny crystals are carried along in the current, creating a shimmering dust called silt. Sometimes, this silt is given a more poetic name, rock flour. Its grains are even finer than sand, yet possess an extraordinary power. Soil rich in silt has an incredible ability to retain water and allow air to circulate, creating the ideal conditions for plants to thrive. Every year, the Tigris and Euphrates carry massive amounts of silt down to southern Iraq, transforming what was once a dry, flat land into a place of remarkable fertility. Throughout the history of this region, and indeed, throughout human history, these tiny particles of dust have played an outsized role. Beyond its fertile clay, the desert plain of southern Iraq has always been a harsh and forbidding place, perhaps the last place anyone would expect human civilization to first appear. While the seasonal floods from these rivers brought life to the land, the flooding here was wildly unpredictable. In Egypt, the Nile rises from Great Lakes in Africa and flows with dependable regularity, serving as nature's stabilizer. But with the Tigris and Euphrates, the water supply depended on rainfall in the mountains of Turkey, Armenia, and Kurdistan, and this could change dramatically from year to year. Years of drought might be followed by terrible floods. In winter, the entire plain could be buried under thick layers of mud. Southern Iraq was also extremely poor in natural resources. There was little more than silt and clay, no metal ores, and almost no stone for building. Because of all these challenges, it took a very long time for prehistoric people to set foot in this unforgiving land. In ancient times, early humans, such as Homo erectus, struggled to survive along the upper reaches of these rivers. Archaeologists have found stone axes and other tools here, some dating back nearly 500,000 years. But the lower stretches of the rivers in southern Iraq were not suitable for the hunter-gatherer way of life. Yet around 13,000 years ago, everything began to change. The first groups of hunter-gatherers started settling down in permanent villages. They noticed something curious. When they tossed the seeds of edible plants onto the ground, it wasn't long before those plants sprouted and grew. This was the seed of a great idea. They realized that if they buried seeds in the soil, watered them, and fertilized them, the plants would grow in abundance. These earliest farmers, once they found good land, naturally had no desire to leave. They began building houses nearby and storing food to last through the winter. They formed larger communities, sharing the work of the fields and protecting their grain stores from those who might try to steal them. They learned to use clay to make storage jars, but for a long time they remained in the mountains, where the rainfall was reliable. Starting around 6,500 BCE, these communities began to spread out. Century after century, millennium after millennium, they slowly moved down along the two great rivers, reaching all the way to the harsh southern lands of Iraq. We don't know exactly who they were, what language they spoke, or what they called themselves. Today, we call that long era the Ubaid period, named after the first site where their remains were discovered. As the Ubaid people migrated along the rivers in Iraq, they discovered new things. They found that in certain places along the riverbanks, date palms grew in abundance, offering a rich and nourishing food source. Before long, they learned how to cultivate and propagate these trees, creating large date orchards. They also noticed that the canopy of the date palm provided shade, sheltering more delicate plants from Iraq's harsh sun and allowing them to diversify their crops. Another important discovery, they realized that it was not necessary to plant crops right beside the riverbank. By simply digging channels, they could carry precious water deep into the land. With the power to dig irrigation ditches, they could plant crops almost anywhere. The people of this region gradually became masters of canal building, and as a result, the land grew incredibly fertile. At the southernmost edge of Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates divide into many branches, forming a delta plain and shallow lakes before emptying into the sea, there arose an ancient marshland. Here, the reeds grow so thick that when standing in their midst, you cannot see beyond the tops of the stalks, a haven for water buffalo, wild boar, and countless waterbirds. Since ancient times, the inhabitants of these marshes have learned to bind reeds into beams so strong they could span a meter or more, using them to build large, domed houses with nothing but this single material. It was in this southern marshland that the greatest cities of the Sumerians first emerged. Just as Mesopotamia was nourished by two great rivers, this land was also home to two great peoples, the Sumerians and the Akkadians. Throughout history, the Sumerians and Akkadians became so intertwined that the story of one cannot be separated from the other. We know quite a bit about the Akkadians of the north. They spoke a Semitic language, part of the same family as Aramaic in the Bible, and later, Hebrew and Arabic. But the Sumerians remain far more mysterious. So mysterious, in fact, that archaeologists refer to it as the Sumerian problem. The Sumerians spoke an isolate language, meaning it has no connection to any other language in the surrounding region, almost as if it stands alone in its own family tree. Sumer is so ancient that the first scholars who discovered their texts doubted whether it was a real language at all. They speculated it might be some sort of code used for secret communications. This led some historians to wonder, did the Sumerians once migrate to southern Iraq from some distant land? Sumerian culture developed along the southern coast of Iraq, giving rise to the theory that they may have arrived by sea. One piece of evidence for this theory comes from the writings of the Roman historian Flavius Josephus, who recorded a Babylonian legend he heard in the 1st century AD. According to the tale, there was a half-man, half-fish creature named Oannes who came up from the sea and taught the people of Mesopotamia the secrets of civilization. Oannes brought them knowledge of writing, science, and every manner of craft. He taught them how to build cities, erect temples, create laws, measure the land, and cultivate crops and gather fruit. When he had shared all his secrets, Oannes simply returned to the sea and swam away. It's possible that in such legends, ancient storytellers preserved a faint memory of the Sumerians arriving by boat, bringing an advanced urban civilization with them. Some have even suggested the Sumerians may have come from very distant places, such as India. Further evidence for the migration theory is found in the way the Sumerians named different professions. For common manual labor, they used words more ancient than Sumerian itself, but for high skill or urban trades, they used entirely new words, purely Sumerian in origin. For instance, terms like scribe or winemaker are purely Sumerian. Yet others have offered a different, even more intriguing theory to explain these contradictions. Though it may sound far-fetched, this idea is worth mentioning. Once again, the clues come from mythology. Sumerian history is always linked to a catastrophic, almost apocalyptic event. And if you grew up hearing the stories of the Bible, this may sound very familiar. The Sumerians believed that in ancient times, during the era of the very first ancestors, a great flood had swept across the entire world. This story would later make its way into the legends of the Babylonian Empire, and then into the earliest chapters of the Hebrew Bible. For that reason, the legend of the flood may well be the oldest story ever told, and it is within this myth that we may find clues to the origins of the Sumerian people. The tale of the Great Flood is especially powerful, so much so that countless historians, with varying degrees of confidence, have tried to identify some real event in history that might have inspired it. And indeed, history is not short on catastrophic floods. When the last ice age came to an end, around 10,000 BCE, global temperatures rose between 4 and 7 degrees Celsius over the course of roughly 5,000 years. Before this warming, enormous sheets of ice covered the northern half of the Earth, reaching as far south as what is now Berlin. But as temperatures climbed, the ice began to melt and water poured into the oceans. Sea levels rose by an average of about 1 inch per year. By the end, the ocean had risen a total of 120 meters, enough to swallow a 30-story building. All around the world, the rising seas drowned coastal lands. The land bridge connecting Russia and Alaska vanished beneath the waves, severing Asia from the Americas forever. The lowlands of northern Europe, now the North Sea, were flooded, turning Britain into an island. In the Middle East, the impact was just as dramatic. When sea levels were lower during the Ice Age, the Tigris and Euphrates extended another 600 kilometers, joining into a single great river that wound its way through the low valley between what is now Iran and Saudi Arabia. This mighty river may have once emptied into the Indian Ocean, not far from modern Dubai. Some historians believe that people of the Neolithic era once lived in this fertile valley after coming down from the mountains of Iran. But then, the ice melted, and the sea poured in. Over the next 5,000 years, the coastline crept inland by 120 meters every year. That's more than a kilometer per decade, or about a meter every 3 days. If people lived in those lowlands, it must have been a terrifying catastrophe. In the centuries that followed, the advancing sea drove them northward. Their villages and forests swallowed one after another. They were forced to crowd together, constantly on the move, never able to settle in one place before the waves caught up again. It was a wandering, restless migration, a people forever chased by the sea. This great journey finally ended only when Earth's climate stabilized and the shoreline reached its farthest point, around 5000 BCE, the very same moment that Sumerian civilization burst onto the stage of history. This theory is further reinforced by the legend of Awanis, the mythical fishman. Could it be that the Sumerians didn't arrive by boat at all, but were actually people who once lived on land now submerged beneath the sea? Another legend, the myth of Enki and Ninhursag, tells of the god Enki creating humankind in a land called Dilmun. Much like the Garden of Eden, Dilmun was an earthly paradise. In Dilmun, the raven did not cry out in sorrow, the lion did not hunt for prey, the wolf did not stalk the young lamb, and wild dogs that prey on goats did not exist. It is believed that Dilmun was none other than present-day Bahrain, an island in the middle of the Persian Gulf, a place that in ancient times may have been a fertile river valley. All we have on this subject is speculation, and until new evidence emerges, these remain only theories. We may never know exactly where the Sumerians came from, but there is much that we do know. The Sumerians called themselves the black-headed people, and the Akkadians referred to them with the phrase Salmat, Quakadi, which carried the same meaning in their language. From the carved reliefs depicting the Sumerians, we see that they wore their hair in curls on top of their heads and kept the sides cut short. Ordinary people wore sheepskin kilts, while the wealthy dressed in brightly colored wool, adorned with tassels and beads. Among the upper classes, both men and women wore jewelry made of copper and, at times, even gold. These two great peoples, the Akkadians, who spoke a Semitic language, and the Sumerians, created a symbiosis that lasted for centuries, their cultures evolving side by side like two mighty rivers. They shared achievements and progress, building cities that flourished and entered history together, but they also shared defeat. The result was that their destinies became forever intertwined. The Sumerians believed the world was a circular mass of land, surrounded on all sides by a vast sea. They imagined that above their heads was another great ocean, held back by the solid dome of the sky, which from time to time let drops fall down to earth as rain. They divided water into two types. Rainwater and river water were considered fresh water, while the sea was salt water. The Sumerians called their homeland the land of the noble lords. To refer to their settled societies, both Sumerian and Akkadian, they used the word kalam, which meant civilization, and the term kur for the mountain regions that surrounded the plain. In Sumerian, kur meant mountain, but it gradually took on the meaning of rebellious, barbaric, or wild. In those days, the world beyond their land must have appeared just like that. To the south and west lay the vast Arabian desert, stretching out like an endless sea of sand where nothing grew and only fierce nomadic tribes made their home. To the north were the Taurus Mountains of Turkey and Kurdistan, inhabited by tough highland peoples, while to the east stood the Zagros range of Iran, the final frontier of their known world. Despite such a harsh landscape, the Sumerians flourished. Lacking stone for construction, they learned to make bricks from river mud. From clay, they crafted everything: pots, bowls, sickles, and writing tablets. With no wood, they harvested large amounts of reeds, bundling them together and weaving them into mats and building materials. The Sumerians invented or adopted the potter's wheel, the chariot wheel, the plowshare, and the sailboat. Their architecture featured complex domes. They knew how to cast metals like copper and, later, bronze. The Sumerians were also remarkable mathematicians. They developed an advanced system of measurement, mastered division and multiplication, calculated angles, and even wrote out the world's first multiplication tables on clay tablets. In fact, Sumerian mathematics is still with us today. They were the ones who divided time into minutes and seconds as we know them, because their number system was based on 60 instead of 10. That's why there are 60 minutes in an hour. The reason for using 60 as the mathematical base was actually very practical, rooted in the human body. If you look at your hand, each finger has 3 segments. The ancients would use their thumb to count these segments, reaching 12 before raising a finger on the other hand. When all 5 fingers were raised, they had counted to 60, and then would begin again. Added to this, a year had exactly 12 lunar cycles, which reinforced the Sumerian belief that this system was divinely ordained. Our modern use of 360 degrees to measure a circle is also a legacy of their system. Thanks to such ingenuity, Sumerian society grew slowly but steadily. They dug vast irrigation canals, expanded farmland along the 2 rivers, and transported goods by boat through the channels. They built dams to regulate water flow and control the spring floods. In fact, Sumerian had an entire vocabulary devoted to types of canals, reservoirs, dams, and water gates. Thanks to these innovations, the landscape of southern Iraq was gradually transformed from parched salt flats and marshes into stretches of green farmland. Many historians believe it was the construction and management of irrigation networks that spurred the Sumerians' extraordinary organizational development. Such massive hydraulic systems required meticulous planning, engineering, and precise calculation. Labor groups had to be organized, and they were paid in food and beer. Overseers and supervisors had to be appointed, and all of this gave rise to a kind of primitive bureaucracy, one that would lay the groundwork for the world's very first states. In the 1930s, the historian Arnold Toynbee famously argued that it was the environmental challenges of southern Iraq that created the conditions for civilization to emerge. The aridity of the land forced the pioneers of Sumerian civilization to confront the dense marshes of the lower Tigris and Euphrates and transform them. The hardships endured by the Sumerians' ancestors were remembered in their legends. The myth of the god Marduk slaying the dragon Tiamat and creating the world from her body was, in fact, a symbolic retelling of conquering raw nature and creating land by draining the marshes. The harsh semi-desert landscape here produced what Toynbee called challenge and response, when people are confronted by obstacles great enough to spur innovation, but not so overwhelming as to prevent development altogether. He believed that if the environment was too easy, there would be no need for social organization or technological progress. Conversely, if the land was too harsh, society would be unable to grow. Only in places like southern Iraq, where challenges were great, but not insurmountable, could the cradle of civilization truly appear. According to Sumerian texts, the very first city of the region was Eridu. One controversial document, known as the Sumerian King List, describes Eridu as the place where the god Enki first decreed that mankind should have kings to rule them. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He was said to have reigned for 28,800 years. He was followed by Alangar, who ruled for 36,000 years. Naturally, many historians have questioned the reliability of such sources, seeing these as either fanciful myths or propaganda designed to legitimize royal succession. Yet the King List also reveals how the Sumerians, at least at some point, viewed their own history. Many believe that Eridu may have truly been the world's first city. It was founded around 5,400 BCE, nearly 7.5 millennia ago, at a time when woolly mammoths, left over from the Ice Age, still roamed far-flung parts of the earth. Eridu was settled by Sumerian-speaking people, and before long, it was joined by countless other small cities scattered across southern Iraq. These independent city-states were centered on their temples and ruled by priest kings called Ensi. Records show that each Ensi was typically aided by a council of elders, men and women alike. Most of the largest cities in this era probably held only about 10,000 inhabitants. The boundaries of the city-states were marked by irrigation canals and by boundary stones, carved monoliths set upright in the earth to claim the land. Art and architecture began to display features we now recognize as distinctly Sumerian, and technology made great leaps forward. This earliest period seems to have been a peaceful one. There is little evidence of warfare or standing armies in these cities. Most towns had no defensive walls at all. A very ancient Sumerian myth called the Gifts of Inanna seems to reflect the spirit of transition in this era. The story tells how the skills and achievements of civilization were passed down from Enki, king of the gods, to his daughter, the goddess Inanna, who in turn bestowed them upon the Sumerian people. Perhaps the ancient Sumerians realized, right from the dawn of settled society, what the scholar Walter Benjamin would later write. There is no document of civilization that is not at the same time a document of barbarism. Indeed, during this era, the Sumerians introduced some of the oldest, most deeply rooted practices in human history, most notably the institution of slave labor. They captured men and women from the mountainous regions beyond their borders and used their labor to build up their own economy. This drew even more people into their orbit, and as the community grew, the pressure on their social systems only increased. Sometimes, that pressure forced people to merge into more complex forms of organization. Around 3200 BCE, writing was invented. A Sumerian epic called Enmerkar and the Lord of Arata recounts the first story of the birth of writing. The poem credits this invention to a king who had to send so many messages that his messenger could no longer remember them all. With his mouth heavy and unable to repeat all the words, the Lord of Kolaba took up some clay, shaped it into a tablet, and pressed the words upon it. Before that, no one had ever put words to clay. The Sumerians had two resources in almost limitless supply: the clay beneath their feet and the reeds that filled the marshes. It was the combination of these two that gave rise to the world's first writing system. A Sumerian scribe would scoop up a handful of clay that fit neatly in the palm of his hand, about the size of a modern smartphone. He would take a piece of reed, cut into a wedge shape, and press it over and over into the clay to create symbols. It was these wedge-shaped marks that gave this script its name: cuneiform writing. At first, writing was used to record ordinary things like rations and supplies. On some of the oldest clay tablets, you can still clearly see what the symbols meant. A bowl of food is drawn next to a mouth and 6 incised marks, a bundle of wheat beside 5 marks. This meant a worker could use the tablet to claim 6 bowls of food and 5 bundles of wheat. The scribes had to work extremely fast, copying hundreds of documents each day. Over time, the pressure to keep up made the symbols simpler and more abstract, until they no longer resembled the real-world objects they once represented. After 3000 BCE, the number of symbols dropped from about 1,500 to just 600, and someone had the idea that each sign could stand for a sound, rather than a whole word or concept. This was the beginning of the very first alphabet, but it also meant that only a small number of educated people could understand writing, giving rise to a separate class of scribes. From that point on, the human mind was forever changed. Now, people could read the words of kings and scribes who had passed away hundreds of years before. They could record all the knowledge they had acquired and preserve it for future generations, and, more importantly, continue to build upon that foundation. Thanks to this ability to store knowledge, Sumerian technology of the era began to advance by leaps and bounds. This next era of history is known as the Uruk period, named for the city of Uruk, which by the middle of the 4th millennium BCE had grown into the largest and most powerful city in southern Mesopotamia. One of the most important markers of the transition to the Uruk period is the clear change seen in the region's pottery. If you think that pottery became more refined over time, you'd be mistaken. In reality, ancient Ubaid pottery was quite beautiful, made on a slow-turning wheel and decorated with geometric patterns in brown or black. Luxury items meant only for the wealthy few. But as the era shifted into the Uruk period, the quantity of pottery produced skyrocketed, while the quality declined significantly. Thanks to the introduction of the fast potter's wheel, craftsmen and workshops could now mass-produce jars, pots, and clay vessels. This was the very first era of mass production. The economic boom of Sumerian cities is reflected vividly in surviving records. Clay tablets reveal that in the city of Girsu alone, as many as 15,000 women worked in the textile industry. That factory employed 134 specialists and 858 skilled workers, most of whom were women. Because there was no currency at the time, workers were paid in food and goods. The minimum ration for a manual laborer was 20 kilograms of barley per month, plus 2 liters of oil and 2 kilograms of wool per year. Supervisors received double that amount. The poor in Sumerian society lived harsh lives, often forced to borrow grain or silver from moneylenders who charged exorbitant interest rates of up to 30%. Despite the growing social inequality, by the middle of the 4th millennium BC, economic progress had turned Uruk into the largest and most powerful city in southern Mesopotamia. That was around 3500 BC, over 5,000 years ago. By then, nearly 2,000 years had passed since the founding of the first city, Eridu, a stretch of time long enough to take us from today all the way back to the days of Julius Caesar. At that point, Sumerian civilization was already ancient, but the first Egyptian pyramid had not yet appeared and would not for another 900 years. At that time, Uruk had about 50,000 inhabitants, just enough to fill a modern mid-sized football stadium. But back then, it was the largest city the world had ever known. The oldest surviving work of literature in the world, the Epic of Gilgamesh, also began in this city. It is the story of the king of Uruk, named Gilgamesh, who may have reigned at some point in the 3rd millennium BC. Whatever the true details of his reign, Gilgamesh left a powerful mark, remembered and celebrated as a legendary hero. Even though most of it is myth, the Epic of Gilgamesh still gives us a glimpse of how Sumerian society changed in those early centuries of the 3rd millennium. For example, it's clear that warfare had started to increase in the region. It's clear that city walls had now become indispensable, but this very source of pride also shows that such constructions were still quite rare. Throughout the epic, the city is repeatedly called Mighty Walled Uruk. We also see that the city at that time was already carefully planned, hinting at a certain level of urban organization by its rulers. Uruk was divided into 3 sections, one part for the city itself, one for gardens, one for fields, and a separate area dedicated to the temple of the goddess Ishtar. At its peak during the Uruk period, the city spanned 2.5 square kilometers. Uruk had a river port, workshops for craftsmen, and crowded houses. At the city's center stood the famous White Temple of Uruk, rising 21 meters high, its white plaster gleaming in the sunlight, making the temple glow even during the day. If you were to walk the streets of Uruk at that time, you would see markets filled with beans and lentils, jars of date, syrup, and oil. In the wealthier neighborhoods, houses were built of fired brick. But elsewhere, homes were simply made from sun-dried mud and clay. The houses were likely arranged in a chaotic fashion, forming a maze of narrow alleyways and cramped slums, shaded by mats of reeds placed overhead to keep things cool during the heat of the day. You'd see farmers carrying bundles of reeds or large sheaves of wheat on their backs, while herders would lead flocks of long-haired sheep into the city. Everywhere, you'd encounter men sitting in circles in shady courtyards, all drinking from a large jar of beer set in the middle, each man sipping through long straws made from hollow reeds. Although the Sumerians imported a little wine from the north, beer was by far their favorite drink. They had more than 30 kinds of beer, with names like white beer, black beer, cloudy beer, and honey-mixed beer. Some types were even flavored with herbs. Beer was brewed directly from the wheat and barley grown in their fields, and if you bought the cheapest variety, you'd see grains floating right on the surface. You can almost imagine the conversations people had around a jar of beer, probably not so different from what you'd hear in bars today. Some of those everyday worries are even preserved in collections of ancient Sumerian proverbs. Those beer-drinking groups surely complained about not getting proper recognition at work. At night, people often slept on the rooftops because it was unbearably hot inside. The city was always filled with all kinds of strong odors. The kilns for pottery and brick burned constantly, sending smoke into the air. The streets had no drainage system. People would often just throw their trash straight out into the road. Inside their houses, they laid down layers of clay, powdered gypsum, and reed mats to give the floor a soft, carpet-like feel. From this splendid urban center, Uruk civilization sent its influence rippling out into the world, and gradually, other great cities began to rise up around it. But as the 4th millennium drew to a close, another Sumerian city was on the rise, one that would soon replace Uruk as the cultural center of Sumer. This city was about to enter a golden age of unprecedented wealth, pushing the boundaries of human art and architecture to new heights. That city was Ur. Ur stood right where the Euphrates River met the sea. It was a bustling port, a fishing town, where gulls soared overhead and fishermen returned with their abundant catch. Its location, both on the sea and the river, made Ur the thriving trade hub of the entire region. As mentioned before, if you needed clay or reeds, southern Iraq was the ideal place. But for almost everything else, the Sumerians had to import. Fortunately, they always had goods to trade. Unlike most other ancient Middle Eastern peoples, they produced a wide variety of food in great surplus. Archaeology has proven that, thanks to advanced farming techniques, the ancient Mesopotamians enjoyed a richer and more varied diet than their neighbors in Turkey or Iran. Researchers have even discovered ancient Sumerian recipes on clay tablets. Here is how they prepared a dish called tuhu, a testament to their culinary diversity. Prepare water, add fat, salt, beer, onions, rocket, coriander, semolina, cumin, and beets. Put everything into the pot, crush leek and garlic, and add them in as well. Let it all blend and thicken, and finally sprinkle with coriander and carrots. Boats laden with wheat, grains, sun-dried reeds, and figs sailed up the river, bringing food to neighboring regions. In return, other resources poured in. Copper came from the mountains of northwestern Iran, and later by ship from the island of Cyprus. Tin traveled along long mountain routes from Afghanistan, as it would throughout the Bronze Age. Silver was carried down the Euphrates from the Taurus Mountains of Turkey, while gold arrived overland from Egypt or by sea from India. Ordinary building timber was sourced from the Zagros Mountains in eastern Iran, but for the most elaborate constructions, magnificent city gates or royal palaces, only rare cedar wood would suffice. This prized material was transported by boat from Lebanon, where these trees grew high in the mountains. The Epic of Gilgamesh even recounts the king's journey to slay a monster in the Lebanese mountains to obtain this extraordinary wood. The ancient Sumerians traded in a way we would now truly call globalization. From their small stretch of coast along the Persian Gulf, their ships braved the waves to reach the trading ports of Bahrain and Oman, then sailed further along the coast to trade with one of the world's most mysterious cultures, the Indus Valley Civilization. From there, the The Sumerians brought back spices, gemstones like carnelian, and the brilliant blue lapis lazuli that they cherished so deeply. They used it for jewelry, amulets, inlays on game boards, and musical instruments, and for magnificent sculpted statues. All these goods flowed through turning it into one of the wealthiest cities of the ancient world. Artifacts excavated from the tombs of Ur's kings reveal not only the immense wealth of the ruling class, but also their masterful craftsmanship, a testament to the thriving community of artists here. One of the treasures discovered in the royal tombs of offers a marvelous glimpse into the lives and customs of ancient Sumerians, an exquisitely decorated piece of furniture, inlaid with shell, red stone, and lapis lazuli. The images inlaid on its surface depict scenes of daily life in remarkable detail from about 4,600 years ago. Today, it is known as the Standard of On one side are Sumerians going to war, chariots pulled by donkeys, soldiers clad in leather cloaks, wearing helmets, and armed with spears and axes. The other side shows peaceful scenes, farmers and shepherds laboring below, while, above them, bald scribes sit at work. This was the height of urbanization in Sumer. By the end of the 3rd millennium BC, most of the region's population lived in cities, and within this urban world, Ur's economic power remained unrivaled. For many centuries to come, Ur's influence would wax and wane. At times, its kings would even claim the titles King of and King of Kish, a nearby city. This suggests that may have conquered and placed some neighbors under its control. But by the middle of the 3rd millennium, Ur's influence appears to have faded. A new era of militarization had begun, as commercial and diplomatic power alone were no longer enough. The city of Lagash rose to prominence in this increasingly violent age. Lagash was a city built on the slave trade, growing wealthy by raiding mountain villages and capturing people to sell across the region. Around 2500 BC, Lagash clashed with its neighbor fighting over a strip of fertile riverbank farmland, an argument that soon erupted into war. A carved stone monument from that time, known as the Stele of the Vultures, has preserved something of the spirit of the age. At the top of the stele is a familiar image, the king of Lagash, named Eannatum, leading his army into battle. They wore leather helmets and reed skirts, their shoulders bearing spears, spearheads possibly tipped with copper or bronze, glinting red in the sunlight as they marched. The king sat up front on an ancient chariot, wrapped in an animal pelt, with spears and a bundle of javelins at his side. When the two sides met in battle, the stele shows King Eannatum dismounting to lead his troops into the fight. Their formation was a tight phalanx, with large shields held in front and rows of short spears bristling outward like a hedgehog's spines. The fighting was brutal. Eannatum was struck in the eye by an arrow, yet survived to witness victory. As the men of fled across the bloody battlefield, the stele depicts Lagash soldiers cutting down their enemies and trampling over the bodies of the fallen. There is something in this relief that marks a shift in the Sumerian spirit of war, a kind of ruthless satisfaction in the suffering of their foes. This is most vividly captured in the scene that gives the stele its name. Vultures circling in the sky, their beaks clutching the skulls of soldiers, gouging out eyes and picking at tongues. The stele clearly portrays a massacre carried out by the city of Lagash, and it does so with a kind of savage pride. Thanks to military victories like this, slave-trading Lagash conquered much of southern Mesopotamia. Lagash established what some historians call the world's first true empire, but that power would not last long. In ancient times, just managing a single city was already incredibly difficult, and the Lagash Empire, despite its military successes, was quickly stretched beyond its ability to govern. More seriously, King Eannatum appears to have ruled through a campaign of terror. It's no surprise that his reign was hated, and rebellions soon broke out against him. As the resentful empire of Lagash fractured and collapsed, a ruler from one of its oppressed cities seized the moment. That was the king of the very city that had been humiliated and defeated by Lagash. It's unclear what exactly made Lugal-Zaggisi so successful, but he surely carried within him a burning desire for revenge against Lagash. Perhaps he had even fought in the battles where Eannatum slaughtered thousands of his own people. Lugal-Zaggisi rose up against Lagash, swiftly overthrowing the kings who still remained loyal to the empire in the cities of Kish and Larsa. He then marched on mighty and after that, the fortified stronghold of Uruk. Both cities soon fell, and Lugal-Zaggisi moved his capital to Uruk. At last, he marched against Lagash itself, the heart of the empire, and here, the fire of vengeance in him blazed fiercely. Lagash did not hold out for long. Lugal-Zaggisi broke through the city walls, plundered, and burned the city to the ground. Even by the harsh standards of the age, this was a shocking act. After destroying Lagash, Lugal-Zagesi's momentum seemed unstoppable. He marched north along the two rivers, quickly seizing every territory Lagash had once ruled. One of his inscriptions even boasts that he conquered all lands from the Upper Sea to the Lower Sea, meaning from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean coast. The Sumerians had never been able to maintain distant colonies or control far-off territories for long. It's more likely that Lugal-Zagesi managed to launch successful coastal raids, sacking a few towns and bringing back spoils to Uruk. But this was the first time a Sumerian prince had dared to make such a claim. For them, the Upper Sea was the western edge of the world, and the idea of a king who conquered all the land between the two seas began to haunt the ambitions of every ruler who came after. But, like the kings of Lagash before him, Lugal-Zagesi made a fatal mistake. He overreached. The empire was simply too large. Before long, civil war and revolt broke out among the Sumerian city-states. In this chaos, another great people of Mesopotamia began to dream of domination. These were the Akkadians, until then merely junior partners in the civilization of southern Iraq. They soon found a leader to rally them against the Sumerian Empire. That man would go down in history with a name in Akkadian that meant the true king, Sargon, the one who would usher in the twilight of the Sumerian age. And as with so many other chapters in Sumerian history, the story of Sargon of Akkad will feel familiar to anyone who grew up hearing tales from the Bible. He was born sometime in the mid-24th century BC, and legend has it that as a child, he was left in a basket of reeds on the banks of the Tigris River. A gardener serving in the palace at Kish found him and took him in. But just like Moses in the Bible, this child harbored great ambitions. There was something truly remarkable about Sargon. Perhaps it was his charismatic presence, because before long, he was entrusted with the role of cupbearer in the royal court, serving wine to lords and royalty. It was a prestigious position, one that opened the door for the young man to advance at court. Sargon must have shown skill in many areas, because soon after, he was assigned a top-secret and extremely important mission. At that time, Kish was still part of Lugal-Zagesi's Sumerian Empire, which stretched from sea to sea. King Lugal-Zagesi was away on campaign, possibly in Syria or putting down rebellion in some distant province. Sargon was given command of a small force with orders to march to Uruk, where Lugal-Zagesi had established his capital. The plan was to launch a surprise attack at the very heart of this new empire and free Kish from Lugal-Zagesi's control. It was a bold and risky plan, but Lugal-Zagesi had taken most of his troops on campaign, leaving only a few to guard the capital. The attack came as a complete surprise. Sargon's forces broke through the defenses, overran the city walls, and the guards scattered in disarray. Sargon captured the city, and before reinforcements could arrive, he demolished sections of those famous walls. This was a deeply symbolic act, a direct blow at the authority of Lugal-Zagesi's empire. King Lugal-Zagesi must have been furious. He rushed back from the battlefield, summoning all his vassals to his side. Inscriptions tell us that as many as 50 kings once rallied under his banner, and the task must have seemed almost too easy to crush the forces of a single, small city-state. But Sargon appears to have been an extraordinary figure in history, the kind of genius like Hannibal or Napoleon, capable of turning the tide even against overwhelming odds. Somehow, in the decisive battle between the might of the empire and his own army, Sargon emerged victorious. Lugal-Zagesi was captured alive, and Sargon paraded him through the gates of holy Nippur, his neck bound in a heavy wooden yoke like an ox. Of course, this was an unparalleled humiliation, but it was at this moment that Sargon showed what set him apart from other kings of his era, because he seemed to possess a certain degree of mercy. The old king Lugal-Zagesi was not executed. Remarkably, he was even allowed to continue ruling over Uruk, as long as he swore loyalty to Sargon the Great. Sargon founded a new city as the capital of his empire and named it Akkad. From there, he continued to conquer much of the territory that previous empires had once controlled. He bowed before the gods, and the gods granted him the lands to the north, reaching all the way to the cedar forests and the Silver Mountain. Sargon did not repeat the mistakes of those who came before him. For every city he conquered, he deliberately destroyed its walls, weakening its defenses and thus reducing the risk of rebellion. He also performed a ritual that symbolized his supreme power, washing his weapons in both bodies of water, the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean Sea. But as the wars subsided, Sargon's achievements continued to grow. He worked to centralize the administration of the empire, even reforming the entire system of dating official records. These reforms strengthened central authority and increased stability across the empire. In many ways, Sargon was a progressive and enlightened ruler, but he was also an Akkadian and could even be called a nationalist in the modern sense. Previously, the Sumerian language was the official tongue for royal inscriptions on palaces and temples. Under Sargon, however, Akkadian appeared for the first time in official records. The cuneiform script was adapted to suit the Akkadian language, and Sargon claimed a new royal title, King of Akkad. He appointed only Akkadians to key positions in the state apparatus and stationed Akkadian troops in the Sumerian cities to guarantee their loyalty. The two great peoples of Mesopotamia, who had lived together for thousands of years, now began to drift apart. Dissatisfaction in the southern, Sumerian-speaking cities grew steadily. Sargon ruled for 55 years, and by the end of his reign, that unrest finally exploded. Yet he still took to the battlefield, defeating them and crushing the mighty armies of the rebel factions. For the time being, Sargon's military genius held the empire together, but as the old king weakened, nearly all the southern cities had openly revolted. When Sargon of Akkad died, around 2284 BC, his two sons had to succeed him and confront the chaos he left behind. His eldest son was Rimush. He ruled for 9 years, spending most of that time struggling to subdue the rebellious Sumerian cities in the south. He crushed uprisings in Ur, Umma, Lagash, Adab, and in fact, 1 year of his reign was even called the year Adab was destroyed. After Rimush's death, another son of Sargon, Menishtushu, ascended the throne. He seems to have relied on the kind of terror tactics that had once made the kings of Lagash so hated. It was not until Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, that the empire finally regained its glory. He put down the Sumerian revolts in the south and restored order to the Akkadian Empire. Naram-Sin did not rule by strength alone. He also seemed to seek reconciliation between the two peoples, who had once been united. He dropped his grandfather's title of King of Akkad and instead declared himself King of Sumer and Akkad, a more diplomatic title. Even so, the rift between the two peoples would never fully heal. Part of the reason was that the Sumerians no longer held a dominant cultural role in the region. For centuries, the Akkadian language gradually replaced Sumerian as the spoken tongue. This was due in part to the policies of the Akkadian Empire, which did not encourage the use of Sumerian in official documents. But there was another reason as well, the increasing diversity within the empire. As we know, Sumerian was a language isolate. Its structure and sounds were completely different from every other language in the area. Meanwhile, the surrounding peoples all spoke languages related to Akkadian, part of the Semitic family. They shared grammar, and even many words, with Akkadian. For them, learning Akkadian was like an English speaker learning French or Spanish, while learning Sumerian was more like tackling Korean, several times more difficult. Akkadian was easier to learn, so it became the language of trade and commerce. For centuries, the people of Mesopotamia were nearly bilingual, but gradually, every Sumerian came to know Akkadian. While fewer and fewer Akkadians needed to learn Sumerian, slowly, Sumerian faded away. Yet the end of the Akkadian Empire was also approaching, and the Sumerians would have one more chance to leave a great mark on human history. When the great king Naram-Sin died, his son, Shar-Kali-Sheri, ascended the throne. He was the great-grandson of Sargon of Akkad, and 4 years after he took the crown, a great omen appeared in the sky. From a distant place in the cosmos, nearly 200 million kilometers from Earth, a giant mass of ice and dust, 40 kilometers wide, swept by, around 2213 BC. This was the Hale-Bopp comet, which would continue to circle the sun for millennia, not blazing across Earth's sky again until 1997. It was the brightest comet ever observed, with the longest visible tail, soaring across the heavens for 18 months, visible to the naked eye. In 1997, the sight of the comet above San Diego, California drove 39 members of the Heaven's Gate cult to commit suicide by mixing vodka and phenobarbital, convinced their souls would be carried away by a spaceship hidden behind the comet's brilliant tail. We can only imagine the shock that such a comet must have produced in ancient times. Some looked up and saw a divine blessing smiling down upon Sumer and Akkad. Others saw it as a portent of doom. In the end, it was that second, more pessimistic group who were correct. During Shar-Kali-Sheri's reign, the world's climate underwent a mysterious and sudden transformation. This shift is now known by a strange name, the 4.2 kilo-year event. Some suspect it was connected to changes in North Atlantic sea ice, triggering a chain reaction in the global climate system so delicate and interconnected. Whatever the cause, the consequences were enormous. Across much of the world, rainfall fell dramatically. Analysis of dust layers in Iraq and the Middle East shows that at this time, annual precipitation dropped sharply and the climate became brutally dry. This period of drought was not short-lived. It lasted for more than a century, and possibly as long as 300 years. The famine and hardship of that time are even recorded in ancient Egyptian texts. and the effects were felt across cultures around the world. Linked to the collapse of Egypt's Old Kingdom, the Indus Valley Civilization, and even the Liangzhu culture in China. In Mesopotamia during this era, under Akkadian rule, resources suddenly became scarce. The age of agricultural surplus was over, and it was during this period that the first towns and cities in the arid north began to be abandoned. After the death of King Shar Kali Shari around 2193 BC, the Akkadian Empire descended into chaos, with years of bloody civil war. None of this chaos escaped the notice of the nomadic tribes in the mountains, known as the Gutians. We do not know who the Gutians were, what language they spoke, or which gods they worshipped, but the ancient Sumerian texts held them in contempt. The Gutians are an unfortunate people, ignorant of the proper worship of the gods, who do not understand the rites of offering. For many years, the Gutians had raided the borders of the Akkadian Empire, burning villages and stealing livestock. For years, these mountain people watched as drought devastated the settled societies of the river valleys. They saw city dwellers fighting each other for ever-shrinking farmland, and at this moment of weakness, they chose to strike. The Gutians gathered their forces and marched down into the Sumerian plain, not merely to raid this time, but to conquer and claim the land for themselves. A unique piece of literature records the tragic events of those days. Written centuries later, it is known as the Curse of Akkad. In this account, the great god Enlil becomes enraged with the king of Akkad for his disrespect toward the gods, and so he summons the Gutians as a punishment. The mountain people are described as monstrous beings, half human and half beast, with a language that to the Sumerians sounded like nothing more than barking dogs. It's unclear how large the Gutian army actually was, but it was evidently enough to quickly overwhelm the exhausted Akkadian forces. It seems the Gutians used hit-and-run tactics, striking supply lines, burning everything in their path. Their attacks dealt heavy damage to the Akkadian economy, and a society already weakened by drought and war collapsed even faster. Not long afterward, the Gutians swept down into the city of Akkad and burned it to ashes. They destroyed Sargon city so thoroughly that, even today, no trace of its ruins has ever been found. The Gutians tried to establish their own dynasty and rule over Sumer, but for many reasons, they failed. In the end, as so many modern empires have learned, conquering a country is much easier than governing it. Cuneiform sources show that the Gutian administration paid little attention to maintaining agriculture, record-keeping, or social order. The Gutians were illiterate, and they struggled to manage an empire that, for thousands of years, had relied on the power of the written word. They simply turned the livestock loose to wander the fields at will. This policy only worsened the famine, causing grain prices to soar. With such neglect and lack of investment, the infrastructure of the country began to decay. Verses in the Curse of Akkad describe how roads grew deserted and wild grass overtook the footpaths along the canal banks, paths that had once served as towpaths for boats. The destruction of central Akkadian authority meant that many Sumerian city-states regained their independence. It appears the Gutians, weakened by their failed attempts at governance, could do little to stop this wave. The Gutians occupied southern Iraq for over 150 years, and this was truly a time of suffering. It was a miniature Dark Age, recorded only in crude, scattered cuneiform texts. But as resentment against their rule grew, uprisings spread across the land, and a Sumerian recognized the opportunity that this time of crisis presented. He was driven by the desire to restore Sumer under the rule of a native Sumerian king, and his name was Utu Hengel. We know very little about Utu, Hengel's life. He was a Sumerian, and he may have served as governor of Uruk during the final years of Gutian rule. He must have witnessed the famine ravaging his people, while the arrogant Gutian kings turned a blind eye, using violence to suppress any opposition. At that time, a new Gutian king had just ascended the throne. His name was Tirigan, and he was typical of the Gutian rulers, uninterested in maintaining infrastructure, and even willing to destroy it as punishment for rebellious subjects. Tirigan had ruled for only 40 days and was still consolidating his power when Utu Hengel, governor of Uruk, decided to act. It's possible that he had been preparing this plan for years, even secretly sending envoys to the southern Sumerian cities, telling them to be ready to rise up once the new king took the throne. When the moment was right, Utu Hengel launched his rebellion. When Tirigan heard the news, he must have been furious. But it seems Tirigan was not a courageous king. He sent two generals, Ninazu and Nabi Enlil, to suppress the rebellion, while he himself stayed behind in his palace. Meanwhile, the rebel leader Utu Hengel rallied his forces and marched out to confront the two Gutian commanders on the battlefield. On the way to the decisive battle, he stopped at the temple of Ishkur to make offerings. He likely sacrificed a sheep or goat and sang ancient prayers in Sumerian before the god's altar. Then he set out to meet Tirigan's army. After leaving the temple of Ishkur, on the fourth day, he camped at Nasu on the Surungal Canal. He captured the envoys that Tirigan had sent down to Sumer, chaining their hands. Utu won a decisive victory, and once again, we see that King Tirigan of the Gutians was not a man of bravery. When he heard his generals had been captured, he fled north to the city of Dabrum. After centuries, the Sumerians had finally cast off both Gutian and Akkadian rule. For the first time since the age of Sargon, a Sumerian king once again ruled Sumer. Utu drove the Gutians back to their mountain caves, restoring kingship to Sumer. The successful revolt of Utu opened a new era known as the Third Dynasty of or the Neo-Sumerian Empire. Some scholars even call this time the Sumerian Renaissance. It was the final, glorious chapter of Sumerian civilization, but one whose achievements would leave an everlasting mark on human history. Although he brought the throne back to Sumer, the rebel king Utu did not reign for long. He died under strange circumstances after just 7 years. It seems he was swept away by a flood while inspecting a dam. If that sounds suspicious to you, you may be right. One of Utu more ambitious governors, a man named Ur-Nammu, rose to power immediately afterward, and many historians believe he may have played a part in that dam incident, if, indeed, a dam was ever broken. But whatever means brought him to the throne, Ur-Nammu soon proved himself a remarkable ruler and outstanding administrator. He standardized copper weights for merchants at the markets, creating units of measurement that laid the foundation for the very first currency. He divided silver into units called mina, with each mina containing 60 shekels. Ur-Nammu also wrote down a code of laws that today is considered the oldest surviving law code, predating the famous Code of Hammurabi by 3 centuries. Beyond all these achievements, Ur-Nammu was also a great builder. He constructed public works at Nippur, Larsa, Kish, Adab, and Umma. He restored roads and canals after decades of neglect under the Gutians. But above all, Ur-Nammu loved building ziggurats. These were the iconic step towers, the pinnacle of Sumerian architecture. Each ziggurat rose in 3 levels, like a giant wedding cake, with staircases leading up to the summit. They were covered with white plaster. Priests who tended the ziggurat could plant trees and flowers on the terraces, and birds would nest high above. Under Ur-Nammu, it wasn't long before every Sumerian city had its own ziggurat, rising as the focal point of urban life. The greatest of them all was the ziggurat Ur-Nammu built in his hometown, Ur. The ziggurat of Ur was truly monumental, standing some 30 meters tall, almost the height of a 10-story building, towering above the city's otherwise low-slung structures. This ziggurat was built entirely from fired bricks, held together with natural asphalt, bitumen. It is estimated that at least 1,500 laborers had to work for more than 5 years just to complete the foundations. Farmers living as far as 20 kilometers away could see its massive silhouette rising above the horizon. To them, this construction was the ultimate symbol of Ur's power and the presence of the god who dwelled there. And yet, even as Sumerian civilization seemed to be flourishing again at the end of this era, their age was quietly slipping away, partly because of the very soil beneath their feet. All rivers carry a small amount of salt and minerals, but the Tigris and Euphrates contain more salt than most other rivers. When ancient farmers brought river water into their fields for irrigation, the intense sun would cause the water to evaporate, leaving behind streaks of salt on the ground. In places with regular rainfall, this salt would be washed away. But in the arid land of Uruk, the salt simply built up. Over time, this small amount of salt accumulated on the surface, gradually making it impossible for plants to grow. The records kept by Sumerian scribes paint a bleak picture. They carefully tracked crop yields year by year. From about 2350 BC, the documents show that harvests all across the region were steadily declining. One detail suggests that salt may have been to blame. While wheat, the main staple crop, decreased year after year, barley yields remained almost unchanged. Barley, as we know today, is remarkably salt-tolerant. Records from the city of Girsu show that around 3550 BC, wheat and barley yields were about equal. But after 1,000 years of irrigation, wheat made up only 1/6 of the total harvest. Just a few centuries later, by the 21st century BC, wheat accounted for less than 2% of the annual yield. All of this points to a dramatic increase in soil salinity. Sometimes you'll hear oversimplified stories about the salinization crisis in southern Iraq, portraying the Sumerians as greedy or ignorant, ruining their land out of a lack of knowledge. But that's not entirely fair. While they lacked modern science, They understood the need to let fields lie fallow for a few seasons to maintain fertility, and they actively adapted, switching almost entirely to barley, replacing wheat in the Sumerian diet. The Sumerians also developed drainage methods and techniques to slow the advance of salt. But even today, salinization remains a major challenge for Iraqi farmers despite all scientific and technical advances. Although people in ancient times did their best to fight the decline, the overall trend was slow but irreversible. The soil became poorer, Sumerian city populations kept rising, droughts grew longer, and the demand for agricultural products became ever more pressing. Eventually, a thick crust of salt would form on the land. Nothing could grow. Today, if you walk across some of Iraq's deserts, you'll find places where the ground crumbles beneath your feet, flaking away like old varnish. That is the salt that once choked the life from the soil and helped bring about the fall of Sumerian civilization. But Sumer's end would not come from the earth. It would come from the point of a spear. As the Sumerians struggled with barren barley harvests, it seemed that once again, outside forces were quick to sense the weakness of what had once been a mighty empire. After their failed imperial ambitions, the Gutians retreated to the mountains, returning to their nomadic ways. But they continued to threaten Sumer through raids on towns and livestock theft. Stopping these attacks was a top priority during the reign of King Ur-Nammu. He mobilized his army, marching into Gutian territory, determined to put an end to the threat once and for all. It's unclear whether Ur-Nammu fought a pitched battle or fell victim to a nomadic ambush, but the result was his death in the mountains. 4 more Sumerian kings followed after Ur-Nammu. Some, like King Shulgi, still achieved success on the battlefield and did everything possible to reform and strengthen the economy. Yet their rule was constantly threatened by dangers from the wild mountain regions, persistent drought, spreading salinization, and food shortages. More and more nomadic tribes survived only by raiding settled lands. By now, the Gutians were no longer the only threat on the borders of Sumer and Akkad. Another people, known as the Martu, became a special menace. The Martu were Semitic-speaking shepherds from the mountains of Syria and Lebanon. Clearly, during this period of drought and famine, the Martu's traditional way of life in Syria became unsustainable, and they began to migrate south, pushing into the fertile riverlands of Sumer. Despite a weakened state, the later Sumerian kings were determined to hold back the Martu. One king, Shusin, even ordered the construction of a nearly 300-kilometer-long wall connecting the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This barrier became known as the Wall of Martu, or sometimes the Wall Facing the Highland. Exactly what this wall looked like remains a mystery, but it was probably a great earthen embankment, scattered with fortresses, and perhaps fronted by ditches fed from irrigation canals. It was more than twice the length of Rome's Hadrian's Wall, and in effect, it turned the rich plain between the rivers into a kind of fortress island. 3 sides bounded by rivers, the south by sea, and the north by the wall itself. It was, without a doubt, an engineering marvel and proves that even in their final years, the Sumerian state retained significant manpower and resources. But in the end, the wall proved useless. Like all walls, it only worked as long as there were enough troops to defend it. Before long, people realized that the wall was not a symbol of strength, but a desperate last measure of an empire in collapse. The last Sumerian king was named Ibisin, crowned in 2028 BC. Almost as soon as he wore the crown, the empire began to fall apart. In his first year, the city of Eshnunna in the east broke away from the empire, and by the 3rd year, Susa, a city of Elam in the Iranian lowlands, also rose up in successful revolt. The Elamites were an ambitious people who would later become major rivals of Assyria and Babylon. But at this point, they were just beginning to rise. Their emergence marked the final chapter for the Sumerian age. The Sumerian Empire, stretched to its limits, could no longer maintain its 300-kilometer Martu wall, and by Sin's 5th year, the barrier built by his father had fallen. The Martu poured through the lines, seizing the rich fields behind them. The consequences were immediate and devastating. A brutal food shortage erupted. In the 7th and 8th years of Sin's reign, the price of grain soared to 60 times its normal value. People starved in the streets. Famine raged through the capital at Ur, and it was clear by then that King Ibisin had begun to panic. In a desperate bid to save his people from starvation, Ibisin summoned a general and sent him north to the city of Isin to buy grain, willing to pay many times the usual price. That general's name was Ishbi-Era, and it was obvious he was not a man the king fully trusted. In another letter, the king even complained that Ishbi-Era was an Akkadian, not a Sumerian, implying doubts about his loyalty, but by that point, the king had no other choice. The Akkadian general Ishbi-Era urged the king to send a fleet of 600 boats upriver to transport grain and volunteered to stay behind in Isen to help defend the city against their enemies. Ishbi-Era must have known that the request for 600 boats was impossible, and in truth, he had no intention of returning to famine-stricken Ur. He remained in Isen with all the grain, and before long declared himself king there. This was just one of many stories that show how the Sumerian state was truly coming apart. Facing threats on all sides, King Ibisen frantically issued a flurry of last-ditch orders. He commanded the construction of fortresses in major cities like Ur and Nippur, but it was all in vain. In the end, the Sumerian Empire fell city by city until only the capital Ur was left, besieged on all sides by enemies. Not long after, the Elamites Paz, once subjects of Sumer in the foothills of Iran, assembled a great army, gathered more tribes along the mountain paths, and marched down to lay siege to mighty Ur. King Ibisen fought back in desperation, and by then, it was clear he had reached the end of his road. He pleaded even with his old foes, the wild Martu, who had just poured through the walls built by his father, offering them payment if only they would help. He even humbled himself to beg Ishbi-Era, the general who had once betrayed him and was now king in Isen, but it was all hopeless. The Elamites broke through the walls of Ur and burned the city. They poured into the sacred precincts, looting every treasure. You can imagine them storming up the steps of Ur's great ziggurat, slaying the priests, seizing every precious object in their path. The fields around the city were burned, the canals became choked with disease. The Elamite army stormed the palace, captured King Ibisen, and led him away to captivity in a foreign land. He was the last king of Sumer, a civilization that had lasted for thousands of years, and he ended his life in chains, a prisoner in exile. The fall of Ur was one of the great turning points of ancient history. It marked the end of the unified Sumerian state and ushered in a miniature Middle Ages, as the city-states fought for power over the ashes of the old empire. The wars of this period left Sumerian cities as blackened heaps of brick, and the people could do nothing but mourn. Meanwhile, the drought dragged on, and the salt-choked fields could no longer yield enough barley to sustain life. Facing this catastrophe, the Sumerians began to leave their ancestral lands, becoming refugees, carrying what little they owned, weeping for their lost homeland as they went. For centuries afterward, a great migration took place from southern Mesopotamia to the north. Some Sumerian speakers settled in Akkad, but their connection to their homeland was broken, and their cultural identity slowly faded. They learned the Akkadian language of the north, leaving their mother tongue behind amid the ruins. The Martu, those highlanders once scorned by Sumer, now settled the cities along the river valleys they had conquered. The Martu, the Sumerian refugees, and the native Akkadians, all these peoples blended together, merging their cultures as so often happened in the history of this land. The foundations they laid would pave the way for the next chapter in the history of Mesopotamia and of humankind, shaping the legendary empires yet to come, Babylon and Assyria.